she finally arrived in Canada. Halima is an active community member. Sorry, Halima is active in community organizations raising awareness about the persecution and systemic discrimination of Hazaras in Afghanistan, as well as supporting new Afghan families that arrive in Canada. Halima is a biology and psychology honors graduate of York University and is an addiction counselor with Addiction Service of the York region. And last but certainly not least, we are honored to have Dr. Akram Ghazabi, who has tremendous accolades and experiences. So I'm going to try to say this in a concise way as possible. Dr. Ghazabi has worked for 20 years at Voice of America as a radio journalist, concentrating on human rights, women's rights, and the rights of minorities in Afghanistan. In 2005, he took early retirement and went back to Afghanistan and founded the political party called NOMA, the Civil Movement of Afghanistan, advocating for civil rights, democratic values, secularism, and empowerment of women and minorities. He also established a private nonprofit drug rehabilitation center called Camp Madar, or Mother Camp, which treats drug addicts. The camp is still active, and so far, more than 8,000 people have been treated, and most of them have returned to society as useful and productive individuals. He has also established a private school for quality education. Dr. Ghazabi is the current chairman of the World Hazara Council, which is a non-political, non-profit, social, and cultural organization that works for human rights and also represents the Hazaras in the diaspora. So as you can tell, and as you can see, we have quite the panelists today. My name is Halima Wali. I'm a co-founder of Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, the Afghan Diaspora for Equality Progress, and Shia Racial Justice Coalition. I myself am an Afghan American and a community organizer in the community. And so just a quick note in terms of the wonderful organizations that are sponsoring this event today. We have the wonderful American Muslim Bar Association, the Afghan Diaspora for Equality and Progress, the Shia Racial Justice Coalition, Justice for Muslims Collective, and Afghans for a Better Tomorrow. So a great group of organizations that have helped put together this event. So now, without further ado, I'd love to get into the rich history of Afghanistan and, get the conversation and discussion going with our panelists. As we discuss and as we, respond to different questions and things like that, we'd love an active chat. So if you have comments, questions, or things like that, feel free to drop it into the chat. There is a Q&A function with Zoom as well. So if you have any questions and if you want any particular panelist to answer it, please ensure that you do that. And so what I'd like to first begin with is essentially a bit of a history and maybe a background about the Hazaras in Afghanistan and about the Shias in Afghanistan. And so Dr. Ghazabi, as our resident scholar here, could you maybe share with the audience what the brief history of what the Hazara community is in Afghanistan, as well as the Shia community in Afghanistan?
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here with all you young activists and panelists. We are really, I personally am proud of the young generation who is working for their motherland, for the people who need support and help in this dire situation in Afghanistan. It is really appreciated that you take time and put your energy and effort into helping those who need help. Hazaras actually are one of the oldest residents of Afghanistan, although it is said that they came with army of Genghis Khan, but that is not really true. Although there are some, we consider Hazaras to be a Turkic Mongolian people. There is Mongolian blood in the Hazaras, and as well as Turkish blood. If you travel to the Central Asian region, you see the Uzbeks in Uzbekistan, the Turkmens, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyzs, and also the Mongols, if you go to Mongolia, all these regions have a lot in common in terms of features, in terms of their culture, in terms of their customs, in terms of their behaviors. And in some cases, there are quite a few common words and phrases among all these people. So you can find some of those words among the Hazaras, the Mongol words, I mean. And so we are not really purely, as I can say, Mongols, but we do have some Mongolian blood in us. Because why I say this? Because in fact, when the Mongols came to Afghanistan, one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan was killed in Bamiyan by the Hazaras, so to speak. And so it is, if they were of one and the same people, there shouldn't have been a fight between them, and also there was no animosity towards each other. We have been in the central part of Afghanistan for time immemorial, and we incidentally we are Shias among the majority Sunni in the country, and that also came. A lot of people say that during the Safavids in Iran, they brought the Shiism to Afghanistan and to the Hazaras. True, because the Amawids, Amawiha, they that was really a burden on the people of the region. So a lot of people revolted against the Amawids, and the hope that they would bring the Abbasids or Abbasiha to the region, and so that they will not be subject to persecution, to all the dictatorship that they had. When the Abbasids came, incidentally, they were more or less the same as the Amawids, because they were all from the Arab region of the Middle East, and they considered others as a lower class people. So it was then that they opted for a system of governing and also of belief that would, as they believed, would directly go to the Prophet Muhammad, to the Imams, to the family of Prophet Muhammad. So that's how they came to be recognized as the Shias. And of two of the Ilkhanites or Ilkhanian, there were two Mongol rulers that they became Shia themselves. And one was called Khudabanda later on, and he was the one who tried to bring Shia to both Iran and to Afghanistan, because he ruled Iran as well. So the history of Afghanistan becoming Shia is rather, as far as I said, I'm not the historian, but as far as I know, it's rather murky, but it goes really back several hundred years. But the point here is why the animosity and why all these hatred are subject to Hazaras, or Hazaras are subject to these hatred and animosity from others, is something that we have to I think talk about, because we are Shias, and you have a lot of countries in the region, Muslim countries, where you have a large or a small population of Shias, but they haven't had the same level of animosity, the same persecution, the same discrimination or marginalization as the Hazaras have endured in Afghanistan. This is one thing that I really want to focus on, if I may, later on or now, if you like.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghazabi. And I think it's very important and very critical to highlight that the history of the Hazaras in Afghanistan is not some sort of recent history, but rather, many decades and if not centuries where that they have been in Afghanistan. I would like to ask, and Dr. Ghazabi and other panelists, feel free to chime in. What do you think has been the single most important, I guess, catalyst to the Hazara persecution that we see? As you've mentioned, there are instances where, yes, the Shia of Afghanistan are being targeted by the Taliban or being targeted by ISIS groups, but there must be a distinction and there must be some level of, I guess, clarity and nuance here where where the Hazara community, though majority Shia, are still persecuted and specifically targeted in many instances. And so I want to ask to our panelists, what do they think, or what do you think is the single most important catalyst that has essentially been the reason why for this persecution to start and really exist for decades and centuries? Darakhshan, go ahead.
Thank you for asking that important question. I think that what is not understood by a lot of people, even by Afghans themselves, is the fact that the state of Afghanistan, the nation state itself, was created on the genocide, upon the genocide of the Hazara people. In order to create Afghanistan, the lands of the Hazara people were taken from them and redistributed. This legacy, so almost how in Canada and America, to create Canada and the USA, indigenous lands had to be taken, genocides happened. The dispossession of the Hazara people's, land and identity and culture was necessary to create Afghanistan. There was no Afghanistan prior to, this history of border creation and creating countries. There was no Afghanistan, in the 1800s until it was created through genocide and through violence. And so the Hazara people were an independent people, just like everybody else in that time. So the nation state of Afghanistan is not that old. That's why we see the legacy of colonialism still impacting kind of communities around the world, but this includes Afghanistan. And that's why when you try to force, I guess, different ethnic groups, different peoples who are not necessarily, who don't consider themselves, I guess, as similar, when you force them into the same country, I feel like that has created a lot of conflict around the world, including in Rwanda and in just states around the world. This is the fundamental problem and legacy of colonialism and imperialism back in the 1800s. So this is important to understand because for Hazaras who consider themselves indigenous to the land, their lands, a lot of the land in Afghanistan was taken from them. And so there is a political interest, there is an economic interest, and a social interest for the, I guess, ruling class of people, the hegemonic groups, to continue to oppress this group of people because, if we suddenly have the Hazara people claiming their rights and speaking up, they would ask for the land back, and they would ask for equality in society, and this is against the direct interests of other I guess, groups of people in the country who have benefited from this dispossession and this oppression. So I think the main reason is ethnic. The main reason for persecution is not just religious. It's not simply because they're Shia Muslims. It's also ethnic and based on politics and based on a history of, it's a combination of religion, sectarian differences, politics, political differences, and cultural differences, and also just the general racism. I think being the other and being discriminated against as the other because we look different and you can visibly identify Hazaras through their facial features makes them very easy targets as well for the Islamic State, for the Taliban. So looking different is not the only reason, but there are political and geopolitical reasons behind underlying this. But just to add really quick, though Hazaras, I guess what I need people to understand in general is that there is no ethnically pure Afghan anywhere. I think that with the DNA tests and 23andMe kind of trends coming up, you soon realize that there is no ethnically pure Afghan anywhere. So though Hazaras may have some Mongolian, maybe 18%, 20%, whatever it is, every other Afghan has similar amounts of, other cultures, whether it's from the Persians or from Indian DNA, etc. 20%, 30%, 40%. There is no ethnically pure Afghan. That's the confusion right now. So for a lot of people, they conflate Pashtun with Afghan. Pashtun is an ethnic identity, but there are twice as many Pashtuns in Pakistan as there are in Afghanistan. So there's ethnicities to understand. People need to understand that there are ethnic conflicts that are based on political and social and economic reasons.
If I may add a little bit of background, I once, many years ago, I translated a document that was called Afghan Boundary Commission, in which the Brits sent delegations to Afghanistan to do some research, ground research in Hazarajat and cases of Turkmens and also of Imaks only, but not others. And in their study or in their investigation, they mostly tried to find out the people in the region and the provisions that they could get. Always there was a title, a subtitle that this area can hold, let's say, so many people for so much time. The provisions are plentiful, and it's a very rich area, and this and that. This was done before the Abdurrahman's invasion of the Hazara land. And at that time, it was, I think, perceived that the Brits wanted to, because the Hazaras were autonomous in that region in central Afghanistan, and they were quite strong. And the Brits wanted to counter the Russian influence in Afghanistan, and they thought that the Hazaras would probably be on their side, on the Russian side. So they wanted the central government to neutralize the Hazaras in the central part of Afghanistan. As a result, this study was made and information of it was used, and then later on they brought people from across the border from Pakistan of those days, the Pashtuns, and they were told that whatever you can get is yours, and all we need is their heads, their property is yours. So once they took over central Afghanistan, they, so to speak, they conquered. You would not probably believe that several of the provinces that are now Pashtun inhabitant, like parts of Kandahar, parts of Helmand, parts of the whole Uruzgan province, parts of Zabul, they were all Hazara land. And they were very, very fertile. They were very rich soil, and they took them and gave them to the Abdurrahman did to his fellow Pashtuns, and drove the Hazaras out of the land, they sold, unfortunately, their girls and women to slavery, and their boys were either killed or kicked out of the region. So the situation was so horrible. I give you a very small example, and this is historically written in a book, that people were so hungry that they were looking for grain in the droppings of horses. Yes. So this is how the Hazaras were treated in those days. And as a result, they actually tried to, they couldn't do, they find the reason to fight the Hazaras, so they declare them infidels, kafir. And that is how they took the farmans or the fatwas or the decrees from some religious scholars of the days who said that the Hazaras are kafir and they are not Muslims, they are infidels. So you are free to do what you want with them. And that is how they conquered Hazarajat, and that is what happened. And a lot of Hazaras that you find who believe in Sunni sect of Islam is because they, to save themselves, they had to convert to Sunni sect of the religion. And that is what happened. So they reduced the Hazaras to, unfortunately, socially, to a very low caste people. So even now, people cannot stand an educated Hazara. Why? But a Hazara, a doctor or a Hazara engineer, because they were supposed to be the lowest strata in the society, like the Dalits in India. So this, coupled with a lot of other things, have made the Hazaras a target to non-Hazara people in Afghanistan. So it's not basically the religion. Religion is one factor. Shiism is one factor, but we have Baloch Shias in Afghanistan, 2 districts that I know for fact. Kijran in Daikundi is totally Baloch, but they are Shias. You have Sholgar in Balkh province, it is totally Baloch, but they are Shias. And you have Shia Tajiks in Afghanistan. Believe it or not, you have Shia Pashtuns in Afghanistan, Turis and Bangash and all these small little tribes of the Pashtuns in southern Afghanistan are Shias. So it's not just religion, but religion is used as a tool. Nowadays, how do they kill a Hazara? The Taliban, for example, if not make it religious, that these are kafirs. So I can go on and on for a while, but let me stop here and I give the others the chance to speak. And if there are any questions, I would gladly answer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghazavi and Darakhshan. I think that very much sets us up well to, understand the historical, the very intentional historical discrimination against Hazaras, from stealing indigenous lands to making sure that they then become, a part of society that is intentionally persecuted, almost, that is intentionally kept in a certain bucket or a certain lower caste, as Dr. Ghazavi said. I do want to go to Halima and ask you this real quick. We see, you are someone that has lived under the Taliban as a Hazara woman who was in Afghanistan. And so we see a lot of Afghans and even non-Afghans pushing this narrative that the Taliban of today are, quote, changed or reformed. As someone who has previously lived under the regime, could you share your thoughts on what the actual reality is? And do you see any parallels of today to the past?
Yes. So as someone who has experienced genocide of Taliban and lived in the time of war, as well as after the Taliban came, and being constantly involved in what's going on in Afghanistan, I have to say that there's a lot of parallel between Abdurrahman Khan, like 128 years ago, throughout each king, and afterward the president who came to Afghanistan, from Dawood to Najibullah, and during the Taliban, and during Karzai and Ashraf Ghani's presidency as well. So unfortunately, the persecution of Hazaras, the discrimination against Hazaras, the systematic discrimination against Hazaras, as well as the land disposition, the genocide, the targeted attacks of Hazaras did not change at all throughout the history. It doesn't really matter who came on power. It could be, it was the people with democracy. During this last 20 years of NATO involvement, the same thing was going on. And I can mention many cases where the Hazaras were discriminated against by the government, and their lands were taken away by the Kuchis and were supported by Ashraf Ghani, by Karzai during their presidency. But of course, intensity was different. So with Taliban, yes, the intensity was different. The Taliban, when they came in 1998, the genocide was basically their slogan. So they entered Mazar Sharif, where I was living, and they said, we're going to kill Hazaras from 7 years old to 70 years old. And they went door to door and start killing people who were not involved in any political or military activities. And it's said that they killed over 2,000 people in one go. But the number of people killed by Taliban or taken away and who never came back goes way beyond 10,000 in numbers. You know, the same thing is happening right now. So from what I remember, so many people start running away from different cities, specifically Hazaras, because they were targeted. And yes, the slogan was that we are going to kill Shias. Shias are kafir, therefore we can kill them, and by killing them we can go to heaven. That happened, and my family, after 3 months with Taliban, we escaped Afghanistan. And I can remember exactly, as I heard the news, same thing happened. So people try to get over the border of Uzbekistan, people try to cross the border in Tajikistan and Turkmenistan and Pakistan, which we took eventually that route. And it was hardest for Hazaras because on the way, even we had to pay a huge amount of money to be protected by other Pashtuns from Taliban, because they would come into the bus. So I remember the way when we came from Mazar to Kabul, the Taliban came to the bus, inside the bus, and said, Hazara Guna, like, where are the Hazaras? And we were all Hazaras there, us plus another family. And they start asking us to come off the bus. But the people who we paid, they talked to them, and apparently they gave them money, and they did not allow us to come out and get killed by them. So there's a lot of parallel. Same thing is happening right now when people are trying to cross the border or cross the borders come to, for example, to Kabul or to Pakistan. They have to pay a huge amount of money and face so many insults and you know, high risk of getting killed and raped by the Taliban, by the ISIS, once they are trying to cross the border. And of course, we heard a lot of news about the woman who was killed as Hazara, the journalists who were beaten up and injured were Hazaras. From my own family, distant relatives, there were 3 young boys beaten up, and then one of them were killed right in front of the parents, and one of them were taken as a prisoner until the family had to pay a huge amount of money. They dropped the half-dead body back to the door. And that's what happened during the 1998. Unfortunately, ironically, from the same families, they came and they took men outside of the houses and from inside the houses, and they killed them right in front of the house and left their bodies laying down there for weeks after taking them all away to cover all the proofs or the evidence of their brutal massacre that they have done. So the claim that the Taliban has changed is completely false, because now every Hazaras and every Afghan knows this, by the way, that the Hazaras are at highest risk right now, and that's how it was before the government when Taliban came. During even the government, the last 20 years, the Hazaras were at highest risk because they were the ones who were persecuted on the road, in their mosques, in their own houses, and educational centers, in schools, maternity ward, at work. We can just name hundreds of occasions where the Hazaras and the Shias were persecuted, but the Hazaras were specifically, the majority of the persecution happened on the communities where the Hazaras were, unfortunately. So yeah, so what I wanna kind of highlight is that even with the government of that was backed by NATO, because the leaders were mainly Pashtuns, they were very discriminatory against Hazaras. Now, for example, right now we know that there's so many people are coming out of Afghanistan. The Hazaras who were in the military, the Hazaras who were working with the government in the academic field, they have trouble coming out because they had the least access to the resources, to the people who could help them. Unfortunately, so majority of the cities that our towns or villages that the Hazaras were living is still very underdeveloped. The roads are all gone. For example, in Daikundi, the Taliban has started kicking out of Hazara people from their lands. Like over 2,000 families are kicked out of Daikundi. They're forced to leave their houses. But the problem is that they have nowhere to go. They cannot, the roads are so bad that they cannot cross and go to the other towns. It's extremely difficult, especially when you have children and you don't have any money on food with you. So that was the result of 20 years of NATO being there as well. So you can imagine if with NATO, so many discrimination, so many persecution, so many systematic humiliation of Hazaras have taken place. You can imagine what's going to happen now with Taliban, who openly claim that they, they're Salafis. They don't recognize Shia anymore. The religion, Shia sect of Islam was recognized by Karzai government as equal to Sunni. But now with the Taliban, when they come back, they did not acknowledge the fact that they should give the freedom to Shia sect. Maybe they're saying that we don't bother Shias to get harmed, but they're still openly saying that the religion, that the sect of Islam that's going to be official is going to be only Hanafi, which is their version of Hanafi, because there's so many things that they do as Salafi and Wahhabi Muslim that this Hanafis don't do, because we have lived with Hanafis before in Afghanistan. We haven't seen so many discrimination and hatred from them as we receive from Taliban and ISIS groups.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you bring up that is incredibly important to, I think, just highlight real quick, is that we understand the baseline, right, where lands were stolen. The Hazara people were kicked out of their land in order to create the nation state of Afghanistan. And then from then on, it was an intentional persecution to keep Hazaras in a specific place in society, in a lower place in society. And that in itself has socioeconomic consequences, right? A lot of times in Kabul specifically, the Hazara neighborhoods, like Halima Jan just said, don't have the best roads. In some Hazara majority neighborhoods in Kabul, they don't have the best schools. The schools are falling apart. And so this becomes a very systemic thing over time, and something that doesn't necessarily change under a quote unquote democracy. And that's something that I think Halima Jan has really highlighted. Even in the last 20 years, when it was a government under Karzai, it was a government under Ashraf Ghani, there was the Hazara community and the Shia community have, many times, several times, have asked for security from the government, asked for some level of safety, and that safety was never provided. And so time and again, we saw Hazara maternity wards in Dasht-e-Barchi being attacked. We saw Shia masjids that are frequented by the Hazara community being attacked and targeted. And so what we end up seeing is this almost systemic model of persecution where, okay, maybe the democratically elected government isn't necessarily killing Hazaras, but they're not necessarily providing access to the greatest schools. They're not necessarily providing safety. And then on the other extreme end, you have, like the likes of the Taliban that literally openly declare that they're going to kill specific sets of people because of their belief system or because of their ethnic background. And so I want to make sure that, you know, the audience and the folks that are listening here today is able to make that distinction where, yes, being Shia is one of the driving factors for some of this, but there is a level of you know, ethnic motivation that is stemmed from centuries that still exists with these discriminations and targeted attacks. Darakhshan, go ahead if you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you mentioned, just because a lot of people also don't understand that even prior to the Taliban takeover, prior to all of this, Hazaras weren't protected by their own government. And it's not just they weren't protected, there were, I guess, to put it simply, let's take the example of Mirza-Alang, the massacre there. There was a joint attack by the Islamic State and the Taliban in Mirza-Alang. And in that attack, you know, these two groups that don't normally collaborate, they did collaborate to attack and massacre, you know, hundreds of civilians in a Hazara village. And you know, they called for reinforcements, and I guess they asked the Afghan government for support and security, and no one came in that, you know, no one came to back up or reinforce, you know, the local militias, etc. for days. It's not that they're, I guess, until the massacre was over, like nobody showed up, you know, to help these villagers. Not just that, there hasn't been in the decades of persecution and massacres, there's been hundreds and hundreds of targeted attacks and massacres. The Afghan government didn't prosecute a single perpetrator of any of these crimes against Hazaras in those decades. And so it's not even just a systemic kind of, it's not accidental. It's just that there are very tangible, I guess, there's evidence and proof to say that the government was complicit, and more than complicit, in a lot of these killings. You know, how did suicide bombers get into these protests, you know, of Hazaras in, you know, like the past 5 years? There have been many protests led by Hazaras, and there has been not sufficient security, and suicide bombers have gotten into these protests quite easily and blown up hundreds of Hazara, you know, youth and activists and journalists. The Hazaras have been asking for security from the government, from you know, other Afghans, and from the international community for decades, and their calls have never been responded to.
Yeah, and I think you know, one of the things that I also want to highlight, and I think Sumaira John could probably speak more to this, is there is also a level of discrimination that is done at you know, at a government level, in schools and stuff, that make it clear that there's a level of persecution against Shia. So let's say you are in Afghanistan, you are not necessarily Hazara, but you are Shia. You are still expected to do certain things in school. For example, my dad, you know, growing up in Kabul, when he went to school, you know, they were taught to pray in a Sunni way, and they were meant to repeat it back in a Sunni way. And so one of his friends accidentally said something that was the Shia, you know, was a little bit different and was said in a Shia way. And his classmate was immediately hit by something. I forgot what it was. And so they essentially was like, you can't say it like that. That's the wrong way. I don't know who's teaching it that to you. And so like he was punished for saying it in a Shia way. You know, my own family members who used to live in Kabul, you know, I hear stories where they weren't able to say the azan in Kabul because there are some parts of the Shia azan that's a little bit different from the Sunni version. And so you were not allowed to say that from the masjid. And so it wasn't necessarily something that you could freely do. There are other instances where, you know, during the holy month of Muharram, a lot of Shias would do sort of like underground processions and underground events to, you know, not face any type of, you know, violence or persecution, or just in order for them to have safety. And so Sumaira John, as someone who is also Shia, but not necessarily Hazara, you know, what does Shia persecution look like in Afghanistan? And, you know, how do you extend that sort of persecution maybe in neighboring countries to Afghanistan?
Sure. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, hello and salam, everyone. Thank you, Halima John, for the warm introduction. So my name is Sumaira, and I'm currently residing in Connecticut. And I was chosen to be part of this wonderful and amazing panel to represent the non-Hazara Shia Afghan community. So I am a Shia Muslim, proud and practicing. And as a non-Hazara, I consider myself a very passionate ally to my Hazara sisters and brothers, because although I'm a minority myself as an Afghan Shia, I'm very aware that I'm still privileged as a non-Hazara Shia from Afghanistan. So just a quick background. The Shias of Afghanistan and the Afghan Shia diaspora here in the US are actually a very proud community. We are loyal followers and lovers of the Prophet's family. So we love the Ahlul Bayt as much as any other Shia community. And it's sad that many Shias outside of Afghanistan don't know that Afghan Shias actually exist, and that we're very, very proud of our Shia identity. So growing up, I never just labeled myself as Afghan. My identity has always been and will be Afghan Shia. And I know that the majority of other Afghan Shias share my sentiments, because our Shia faith is very central to our lives and our existence. So yes, in a nutshell, Afghan Shias exist. And hopefully very soon we'll start taking up more space in mainstream Shia places, because we're very active and outspoken, and we have a lot to offer. So a quick background on the ethnic makeup of the non-Hazara Shia population. The majority of Afghanistan's non-Hazara Shia follow the Jafari school, or the Twelfers, but there is a small minority of Ismaili Shias too. And the main ethnic groups are Farsi ones, who are originally from Eastern Iran. And my family are Farsi ones, which basically means we're Farsi speakers and we're Shia. The other ethnic groups include the Ghazalbash, and their ancestry is traced back to Azerbaijan, the Bayad, who are Turkic, and the Sadat population, who are Sayyids, which means that they trace their lineage all the way back to our Prophet, Bibi Fatima, and Imam Ali alayhi salam. So from my experience of growing up and closely following the news and events in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, I strongly believe that the persecution of non-Hazara Shias in Afghanistan is mainly due to our proximity to our Hazara sisters and brothers. So what I mean is that Shia persecution in Afghanistan currently is very much tied to Hazara persecution. So if a non-Hazara Shia is killed or targeted, it's mainly because they happen to be in a mosque that's predominantly Hazara. And sadly, the perfect example of this is the very recent bombings of two Shia mosques in Afghanistan by the Islamic State of Khorasan. The first bombing took place during Jummah prayer, Friday prayers in the city of Kunduz, where anywhere between 50 to 100 worshipers were killed. And exactly 1 week later, also during Jummah prayer, Friday prayers, another Shia mosque in the city of Kandahar was attacked, and estimated 35 people were killed. And what the Western media likes to report these events, or as the main headline is, Shia mosque attacked by Islamic State. And yes, although both of these were Shia mosques, they were both in very predominantly Hazara neighborhoods, which the Western media leaves out in many of their narratives. So I believe this is because the Western media has its own agenda. So instead of focusing on the fact that these attacks are tied to an ethnic genocide of the Hazara people, they just want to further demonize Muslims and make it look like it's Sunni and Shia killing each other. And I feel like as a non-Hazara Shia, it is my responsibility to speak up and let them know, yes, Shias are being attacked, but it's mainly it's the Hazara population that's under the real threat of a genocide, something that they faced in the past, and something that they're likely going to face again under the Taliban if the international community doesn't do anything about it. So I mean, I have more to say concerning about what's happening to Shias in Iran. Do you want me to further elaborate on that, or we can come back?
Well, I think one thing that Sumaira John, I think that you mentioned that I think is very important is the intentional erasure of genocide of Hazaras. And that's something that happens time and again. And even when there are attacks on Shia, on the Shia community in Afghanistan, like you just said, oftentimes it's motivated because there is, you know, a Hazara community that is there. And so I think one of the things that is incredibly important to highlight with that, you know, with what you've just brought up, is that despite the Shia and Hazara communities having many similarities when it comes to faith, there is a different level of privilege that a non-Hazara Shia person has in Afghanistan versus someone who is Hazara and is Shia. And so I think that's something that is oftentimes overlooked in a lot of the discourse when it comes to Afghanistan, and when it comes to the discourse of persecution in Afghanistan, that essentially erases the ethnic part of it and the ethnic part of the equation. So I think that's incredibly important to highlight. The one thing that comes up, at least in my mind, when we talk about these things, is that because of this, right? Because we know that there's an ongoing erasure of, you know, the Hazara genocide, an ongoing erasure of the struggle of the Hazara community, there ends up being specific barriers that the Hazara community might be facing that other ethnic groups in Afghanistan are not. And this is what I mean by there's a level of privilege that other groups in Afghanistan might have. And so I do want to touch base on that. Halima John, if you have anything to add there, or Darshan, Dr. Ghazabi, please feel free.
I just wanted to add that it's very important to verbally and clearly state this distinction. And I really appreciate yourself and Sumaira making this statement that yes, the Shias are you know, limited to practice their belief, their religion openly for so many years, and it's a painful situation to be in, where you have to lie about your religion. You have to do otherwise. When you go to school, you have to you have to cover your belief system, and you know, and you know, go do the rituals, but in an underground, and not express your religion openly and in freedom. So it is painful, and but being a Hazara, who are majority of the Shias of Afghanistan, and then going through this systematic discrimination against them, even by the Shias of the same community, that's next level of you know, a painful experience that you can have in your own country by so many different ethnic groups, including the Shias of your own community who are not Hazaras. So this statement is important because so many times in our community, when we speak about Hazaras going through this discrimination, everyone shushes. So our community members, like especially in the Shia community that I am from, everyone is like, you know, don't say this. You know, everyone is suffering. Everyone is a target, and please do not name Hazara, because we don't want to. We want to stay united. We don't want to mention Hazara, Tajik, Pashtun. This is against the unity of Afghanistan. But this is very invalidating for the Hazaras, because yes, all the other people are suffering, including the Pashtuns, because this war is not going to spare anyone. But the fact that for Hazaras to be targeted for their ethnic background, for their features, it is expected that people recognize it and verbally even state it. I know it's a common sense. Everyone in Afghanistan know that Hazaras are targeted, but when you try to speak it in a community level, in a leadership leader, people try to like quiet it down and say, do not talk about it because it's going to bring up conflict. But it's important that like people like us, we come and speak about it, because this is going to open the ground for people to validate each other's pain. Decided to get rid of those very subtle but still strong discriminations against Hazaras, even by the Shia communities. You know, which of course it's understandable that when you're persecuted for so many for over centuries, and you're looked as down as a second-class citizens. Like I have a friend who says that her friends at school didn't know that she was a Hazara, and when they saw her cousin with her, they saw like, is that your Hazara? Which she was referring, is that your servant? So that level of discrimination and prejudice is painful, and especially if it comes from their Shia communities, where you expect them to respect it more, and not mentioning it, not validating it is not helpful at all, because that's going to just keep people quiet and suffer alone, where we could use our forces together and fight this huge discrimination. And it would be also hopefully open the Sunnis, the other Sunnis, the normal Sunnis who are not extremists, who are not Salafi Wahhabi, who are not against the Hazaras or against the Shias, who are educated and academic and humanitarian. They also come and with us and raise this important point that everyone in Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan should be respected, regardless of their ethnic background, their features, their religion, or their certain beliefs that they have. So thank you. I really appreciate Sumaira Jan, your points.
I think Halima Jan touches on something that I would love Darakhshan to expand on, is that this notion of, oh, don't bring up your struggle because we're all struggling. And it has a very much like to put it into maybe an Americanized / Canadian context, a very much like an all lives matter type of response, except in an Afghan perspective. Darakhshan, what are your thoughts on that in terms of folks that respond in that manner?
I think, put simply, it's similar to asking, I think the all lives matter sentiment is understood to be harmful in America, with when somebody discusses their specific targeted persecution, their specific grievances, and somebody else responds with, well, everyone's hurting. I don't think it's constructive. I think it's actually very harmful. We could also be saying, well, why talk about Afghanistan? There's Syria, there's Yemen right now. It's not helpful to the conversation for other Afghans or other people to perceive kind of the expression of grievances by Hazaras as it doesn't hurt other Afghans to discuss Hazara issues. I think that the sentiment really is coming from a place of not wanting to hear about this persecution. It comes from trying to silence the Hazara voice, as has been happening throughout history. What I think is really important to actually touch on really quickly from the last point is the fact that even there's this hesitancy by everybody, by Afghans, by the Western media, to not name Hazaras as victims. And there's differing reasons as to why, but when we have attacks, for example, in, for example, the maternity ward, people are well aware that nurses, mothers, newborn babies were killed in this targeted attack by the Islamic State in this maternity ward. The media did not report it as a direct attack on Hazaras. Why? Why are we not naming the victims of these attacks? That's a question I want to ask other Afghans. I want to ask the public. I want to ask the media. The Islamic State militants specifically targeted that hospital in a specific Hazara neighborhood in Dashtabachi in West Kabul. That neighborhood was targeted, that hospital was targeted because the people there were Hazara. And this is something we need to start naming actively as Afghans and as even in the West. We have to start understanding why are these people and these communities being attacked. Because when you're not actually being, I guess, honest about what the reasons are, we do a disservice to the victims. So we're talking about also the attacks against the schoolgirls, the 200 schoolgirls. Again, where did you hear the articles that they oftentimes fail to mention the fact that they were targeted in a Hazara school, in a Hazara neighborhood. The headlines mostly read, attack against women's education, or, why do they hate women? And they largely ignored the fact that these schoolgirls were targeted because they're Hazara. Same with the tutoring center. And, a lot of these attacks in Kabul and are in Hazara neighborhoods, this is not mentioned, unfortunately. And so what we have to turn the dialogue, from like this all lives matter, like all Afghan lives matter. That is, everyone is aware of this. But because all Afghan lives matter, we have to discuss Hazara issues, if that makes sense. It's similar to World War II. Everyone is suffering in a war, but the Jewish people were being specifically targeted based on their religious identity. And in Afghanistan, the Hazara people are being specifically and systematically targeted for their ethnic and religious identity. And that's really important to mention because they are the most marginalized population, the most at-risk population right now. And if we're not looking after, I guess, the most marginalized, I feel like the whole country, is going to suffer as a result. So I think that I guess I would like to ask other, Afghan activists to keep this in mind as they're moving forward with their efforts. We do hear a lot of silencing. We hear a lot of, why are you discussing ethnic issues or Hazara issues? They're not ethnic issues. They're human rights issues. They are Afghan issues. Hazaras are Afghan citizens too. So Hazara issues are Afghan issues. And so this is the key point that I want to make. If we're trying to silence people, that's not unity. True unity is in empowering and uplifting and amplifying all voices. And if we're actually trying to shut down voices because they're sharing an uncomfortable truth and reality, that's part of the, continuation of this history of silencing, subjugating, and oppressing the Hazara voices. So please, do try to ask questions as to why are these people being targeted and how can I help, as opposed to, be quiet and stop talking about Hazara issues because it's not unifying.
And I think, thank you for that. And I think it's very critical to then, contextualize everything that our panelists have been saying to contemporary issues, right? And one of the things that we can immediately tie that to is the last 2 weeks of August, where it was complete chaos. Afghanistan was quickly falling into the hands of the Taliban, and there was, massive efforts for evacuations and for people to leave the country. And so one of the things that Hazaras faced was discrimination, even to try to leave the country, even if they had proper paperwork. Let's say if they had visas and stuff like that, they were literally profiled at airport gates, at checkpoints, to then basically prohibit them from getting to an airplane or from potentially leaving the country. And so that that isn't necessarily something that was just born yesterday, right? This is something that has become normalized through not only the lack of safety and security that the previous governments have provided, but from the centuries old persecution that has never been addressed in Afghanistan, that has never been addressed with different communities. And so that's something that was seen even during the evacuations and the chaos of the last 2 weeks. I want to ask, what is something that we can do? And this is for any of the panelists. What is something that we can do as Afghans, as non-Afghans, as non-Hazaras, as even non-Shias that might be living in the United States, in Canada, in places outside of Afghanistan, to help and support the Hazara and Shia communities inside of Afghanistan?
If I could add a few points.
Of course,
I appreciate your point when you mentioned earlier about the non-Hazaras raising the issue of religion or Shiism in Afghanistan, and also the human rights issue. First of all, there is this misconception in Afghanistan that there is a national unity. There has never been a national unity in Afghanistan. And when we raise the issue of Hazaras, for example, or Tajiks or Uzbeks, nowadays they say, oh, in the past, there wasn't anything of this sort. They were, but they were hushed up. Nobody was allowed to talk about it. When you don't talk about a problem, that doesn't mean that the problem does not exist. It does exist, but you don't talk about it, So first of all, I would like to very sincerely thank you, ladies and gentlemen, especially you young ladies, for raising this issue. because for me to talk about the Hazaras is normal. I've been doing it all my life. But for a non-Hazara to raise this issue is very important to us. I give you a small example. I studied at the American University of Beirut, which was the hotbed of revolution in the late 60s. There were Palestinian problem and the refugees, and later on with the civil war in Lebanon. And a lot of times the Palestinians would take us, among them me, to certain conferences where they would ask us to talk. And I would talk there and I would say, look, I'm not Arab, I'm not a Palestinian, but I'm a human being. And I stand for those who are driven out of their own land. I want to talk about the human rights of these people. So when others talk, and this was very valuable to the Palestinians, because if they themselves spoke, it was supposedly their duty, or it was a fashion for a Palestinian to speak about the Palestinian rights. But for a non-Arab and for a non-Palestinian, it was very, very important, because it broadened the issue. It just didn't let it be there as a Palestinian issue, but as a human rights issue. You know what I mean? So the same thing, I appreciate your efforts, because when we talk about the Hazaras, it's normal for us. But when you talk about it, you would say, look, I'm not a Hazara, but these are human beings. These are my fellow compatriots or co-religionists. If they don't mention it, they have the right. Like I stand for the Rohingya Muslims when they are driven out of Myanmar. I'm not a Rohingya. I've never been to Myanmar, but I see these human beings suffering enormously. I find it my human rights, how shall I say, I find it my duty as a human rights activist to raise this issue. Like in Afghanistan, most of the things are directed against the Hazaras. And for us, for the Afghans to say, oh, it's okay, it's just the Hazaras. It will come to you one day. Like in the case of, for example, education. We thrived during the last 20 years. We had private schools, private universities, we had quality education. And you know what they did? They started putting a quota so that certain number of Hazaras could go to the university and certain number of others should go to the university, even if they are semi-literate or illiterate. I'll give you again an example. I've lived in Pakistan, in Balochistan, where this quota system exists. The Hazaras compete, they have 3 seats. They compete, let's say 200 people compete for 3 seats. And they are the top of the top. The Balochis don't have to compete because they have, let's say, out of 500, they have 300 assigned for them. So among the Baloch, there are people who have difficulty writing their names. But just because they are Baloch, just because they have this quota system, they can go there. While the Hazaras, most of them are left out. So this is one thing that we wanted at a time, for people to raise this issue, that this is discrimination against these people. And the election is a normal practice in Afghanistan. Once we got the majority without any vote rigging or anything in Ghazni, we got 11 out of 11 seats. The Hazaras did. Next time, what they did, they put a quota in it. You know, that they should not have 11 Hazaras out of 11 seats. Well, I didn't buy it. I voted. I campaigned. If you don't, then it's your fault. So these things are directly I mean, these are intentionally directed against the Hazaras. We raise this issue as we raise other issues in Afghanistan, but it is not like all lives matter. It's true, all lives matter, but we are also lives. You know, all human beings matter, but we are also human beings. And we have our greater proportion of discrimination, of the marginalization. So there should be more emphasis on us than on others. Once we get equal opportunity for all, I would give up. I would stop, because I don't need that. I need my right. Once I have my right equal to the rest of the population, I would stop there. I don't discriminate against others, and I don't raise the Hazara issue out of racial intention, because my right is trampled. I have to. Thank you.
Always a great pleasure hearing Dr. Ghazabi speak. So thank you for sharing that. For, and this is open to any of our panelists, what are some things that can be done right now to support the Hazara and Shia communities? Is there anything that can be done at a policy level? What sort of the feel for that? And then we'll quickly go into Q&A after this last question, and then I will share a resources doc to the audience. I'll drop it into the chat. That document will be updated. And so if you want to stay in touch with additional action items, stay in touch with the organizers and stuff like that, I will drop that link in there into the chat. So our panelists, is there anything that the folks that are tuned in can do to support Hazara and Shia communities in Afghanistan?
But once again, I don't want to monopolize this talk, but with a great apology, I have to say that I have to be out by 5 to 9 because I'm in a different Zoom meeting. I didn't know that theirs was scheduled this, but anyway, I thought
no worries,
my understanding was 5:30. I later on found out it was 7:30. Anyway.
No worries, Dr. Ghazabi. If you want to answer the previous question, go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do. The first thing is that I receive, as a World Hazara Council chairman, I receive a lot of requests, ladies and gentlemen, because there are people who they're lost, so to speak. The Hazaras are lost. I'm sorry to say, they don't have any leaders who speak for them. They don't have any supporters, and they feel lost in the middle of nowhere. So we have teachers, we have professors, we have judges, lawyers, prosecutors, engineers, that I know most of them, they request for helping them to get evacuated from Afghanistan. I don't want to mention this, but I think you know that the majority of out of, let's say, 130,000 people that the Americans brought here, maybe 1,000, probably 1,000 of them are Hazaras. The rest are not. And they brought even villagers, not only Afghans, but Pakistani villagers, who at some points in Canada and in America asked for Urdu translators, believe it or not. And there are people who don't know how to use the bathroom, how to use the toilet. They have made a mess out of the whole area. But because they've never seen the city. But they are brought here because there were 3 layers to the airport. One was the Taliban. They did not want any Hazara to get in. The second layer was a group called Unit 01 and Unit 02. The majority of them Pashtuns. They were trained and supported and helped by the Americans. They did not let the Hazaras. The third group that was there was American. So for most of my people, they could not go through the first layer or the second layer. to get to the third. And these are all left behind, and they are in fear of being prosecuted. They are searching their houses. And if we can do anything to help these people that are left behind and they really deserve to be taken out of that hell, I appreciate. My email is with you. We can share information, how to do things. I have some other sources as well, but I would appreciate if you can help me in this regard. It would really be a great thing. And with that, I think I would leave you in peace. I would stay for another 5 minutes if there is any question directed to me. Otherwise, I will stay for 5 minutes and then I would have to leave. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you,
for
Dr.
what
Hazabi.
you do.
Thank you. If you could hang on for maybe 5 more minutes, I do see 1 or 2 questions that might be related to you. But before we do that, Halima John, do you want to add in terms of what folks can do right now to help?
Yes. So adding to the point of Dr. Gizabi, that so many people need to get out, that their lives are at high risk. Literally, Taliban is searching for them door to door. So that would be an amazing thing that anyone can do in different fields, either donating or trying to connect them, advocating for them. That would be amazing. There are some organizations who are doing fundraising to help people in Afghanistan, the Hazaras who are displaced, the Hazaras who are facing extreme poverty issues, because it seems like we're going back to the Abdurrahman Khan area, where Hazaras forced to now go back to slavery. If you're not allowed to work, what could you do otherwise, right? So thousands of families are now in the cold with no food, no aid, and they're going to literally die without any bullet shot at them because of the cold and the harsh weather and the lack of food and aid. So if you would like to help those people, please reach out to any Shia community around you and other organizations such as Comfort Aid International. There are multiple ones. There's another one, the Bamiyan Foundation. If you're in Australia, there are Bamiyan Foundation in Australia as well. Hazara International, the Lady Fatima Trust is also supporting. JCC in Canada, also, and Zahra Center also collecting funds and trying to reach out to the communities in Afghanistan to support the Shias and the Hazaras, including the last attacks victims in Kandahar and Kunduz. So that would be amazing. And the other thing is that, again, if you're in Canada, please support the sponsorship. So many organizations are working on collecting fund and forming group of 5s to sponsor Shia Hazara families who are either in Afghanistan or stuck in outside Afghanistan. Again, the chain of discrimination comes all the way outside Afghanistan. Unfortunately, even when they are in other countries, they are having trouble crossing those barriers to get sponsored or resettled and outside. So that would be amazing thing that you can do.
Thank you so much for that, Halima John. Dr. Hazabi, I'm going to go to the Q&A. I think this question, it will probably be something that you can answer. Sabira Ibadi asks, were Hazaras ever rulers or held political power in Afghanistan, or were they just landowners and ordinary indigenous people?
No, the Hazaras were not rulers. We had autonomous regions before Abdurrahman came to power, and with the help of the Brits, they subdued us. We did not have any rulers as such, Hazaras, but we had great leaders. Like during the Saduzis, we had one guy in the central Afghanistan who united our people, and then later on during against the Taliban, we had Abdul Ali Mazari who tried to unite the people, but we did not have any rulers.
Thank you for that. Another question that I think anybody on the panel, if they want to answer, Noma asks, what are books on Hazara history recommended by the panelists?
Most of the books are in English, in Farsi actually. There are two that crosses my mind. There's one by Nematullah Ibrahimi, who is an Australian professor that I respect very much. And there is one, the Hazaras by Dr. Musavi, Said Askari Musavi. But there isn't anyone that crosses my mind, any English there, but there are a lot of Persian or Dari books written on Hazaras by Hazaras and some others that are translated.
And in the resources doc, we will continue to add items in there. Darakhshan, would you like to add in terms of things that folks can do today to help support the Hazara community?
Yeah, definitely. I think Dr. Ghazabi raised a very, very important point regarding the current evacuations. Obviously, any group that is already marginalized, the Hazaras right now, throughout history, have had the least access to social, political, and economic capital in Afghanistan. So during any event, during any war, during any evacuations, etc., takeovers, they are the most vulnerable right now. But the problem is that their level of vulnerability and risk right now is not correlating to evacuation efforts. So we're getting reports from a lot of, not just Canada, America, just that the fact that Hazaras make up, at least 15-20% of the population of Afghanistan. At the bare minimum, they should make up 15 to 20% of evacuations. And right now they make up in a lot of places like 1%, if that. They have systematic barriers to being evacuated, to having access to the networks, to having access to getting to the airport. There's so many reports of the Taliban or even other security forces that are because of racism and discrimination, physically assaulting and beating Hazaras as they tried to get to the airport, saying, you are Hazara, we're not going to let you through. From the Pakistani border, they were literally barring a lot of Hazaras from crossing. There are a lot of barriers for Hazara people to access the same asylum and the same resettlement that is granted to Afghans. And there may be programs, for example, Canada has announced 40,000 spots for refugees, but Hazaras can't access a lot of these spots right now for a variety of reasons, yet they have the highest need. Given their vulnerability, their numbers should be double, instead of, if they are, for example, 15-20% of the population, given the fact that they're at risk of genocide right now, they should be making up at least like 30-40% of the evacuations. And so 1% is unacceptable. It's not okay, and it's frankly negligent. We have to start acknowledging their heightened vulnerability, their dual vulnerability, because on the one hand, you'll have a Hazara journalist, activist, police officer, judge, who is going to be at risk for helping the West, like everyone else. And then on top of that, they could be beheaded on the street or by the Islamic State, or shot because of their face and their ethnic identity. So if we don't acknowledge this in evacuations, we're going to just basically stand by while this population continues to be subjugated and massacred. And I think the second point is that we have to raise more awareness about the specific targeted persecution and genocide of the Hazara people. I won't even give you my words. I'm going to give you the words of Gregory Stanton, the founding president of Genocide Watch. He warns that every indicator of genocide is present in Afghanistan for the Hazara people. Every red flag is present. And so he said, if we don't act, this is going to be worse than Cambodia. We're going to see, the risk is incredibly high, and the awareness and the action is incredibly low, not just in evacuations, just more broadly as well. The Hazaras face a threat from the Taliban, who have historically committed ethnic cleansing campaigns against them. They face a risk from the Islamic State, which emerged in Afghanistan in 2014, 2015. They face, if you were concerned about the Yazidis, you should definitely be worried about what's going to happen to the Hazaras under the Islamic State. The treatment of religious minorities by the Islamic State, they consider them heretics. The punishment for this is death, to fundamentalists like the Islamic State. So what I'm trying to get at here is that there are so many layers of risk and genocide that we need to first educate ourselves on, speak about it, and really just make it a priority. We have to, at the bare minimum, offer the same, I guess, allocation for according to demographics for Hazaras and evacuations, but really we should be doing more. We should have, we should really actively, vocally say, like, this population, this demographic is at a very high risk of genocide, and we have to act immediately and urgently to support them. So yeah, just understanding the systemic barriers, acknowledging this through action and through evacuations, educating ourselves, and supporting groups that are trying to help. There are a lot of groups that are trying to raise awareness and help with evacuations. They have little to no support from non-Hazaras. So we have to just get this on our priority list and understand, and empathize with Hazara community members. It's not just about ethnicity here. It's about really humanity and one's humanity and connection with people who are suffering. The question for you is, not you, but broadly the public, do you care about the human suffering of this community, and are we willing to do something about it before it's too late? I don't want to look back at this and in 5 years, 10 years and say we could have prevented another genocide, and we had all the indicators there. We are aware, we have the data's there, we have the resources, we have the internet. What more are we waiting for is my question, to act.
I think the genocide has already started.
I'm sorry, lady.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I have to leave. Yes, the genocide already started quite some time
Thank you,
ago.
Dr. Hazabi.
Thank you, Dr. Ghazabi.
Thank you all.
Incredible.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all. I
Incredible.
really do appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Hazabi.
Thank you.
Halima John, do you want to add, and then Sumaira, do you want to add anything else before we wrap?
I want to quickly add that for all the Shias and the Sunnis, the religious people who are present in this group, please try to raise awareness about the fact that these groups who are using the religion as a political tool need to be recognized as terrorist groups. The Taliban and the government and the previous governments of Afghanistan is still. All of these people who are using religion, they need to be recognized, and they need to be called out, because if not, then many people are going to turn away from religion, from Shia and Sunni. We need to make it clear that these people are not Muslim, they are not Sunni nor Shias, and they have no base to kill Shias or Hazaras, and no Sharia, no religious base. And on top of it, that I would like all the Shia communities to make it clear in their organization, in their religious institution, that they are standing with the Shias and with the Hazaras of Afghanistan. And that will help us to feel really validated once, and next is that we can do a lot together as a faithful people, alongside with other people who are doing humanitarian work.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of questions. I apologize if we can't get to your questions. Feel free to stay in touch via the form that's inside the resources doc. We will try to get back to you. Sumaira John, do you want to add anything, any last words?
Well, thank you for this amazing panel. Thank you for everyone who attended. And yes, I want to emphasize what Halima John said. As a Shia Muslim, I'm asking the larger Shia community, and not just the Shia community, our Sunni brothers and sisters, the larger Afghan community, that this is something that's in real time, and it's something that's likely going to happen, the Hazara genocide, and that we should not forget, because Afghanistan's probably going to slowly fade out from the mainstream media, but that doesn't mean that the persecution of Hazaras is going to stop. So this is definitely something that's going to keep going, and that's why we should keep speaking out against it.
Thank you. Well, it's 9 o'clock here on the East Coast. Dr. did you have any last words?
Oh, very last thing, sorry. If you have media contacts, please urge them to cover the killings, the massacres, and the persecution, because right now, obviously, the Taliban have cut telecommunication lines in so many Hazara areas. There's a blackout. We don't even know how, what's happening in a lot of these areas, and we need to find out, because a lot of these genocides and atrocities happen during these media internet blackouts, there aren't enough journalists covering this issue. We're not hearing about the fact that, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Hazara families have been displaced in the past few weeks. Their homes have been either taken or they're razed or burned. They have been, pushed out of entire, regions. We have to start really covering this, because if we don't, we're not gonna, I guess, without media, without awareness, you can't actually document these atrocities. And so please cover these killings. Amnesty has written a report recently about, the massacre and torture of Hazara civilians in Ghazni province and different provinces. But there have been ongoing reports of torture and massacre of Hazaras right now. So the genocide has started. People aren't covering it. So if you have contacts in the media, have any contacts anywhere who can help bring this issue to the public awareness, please do urge them to do so. That's the last thing I wanted to say.
Thank you so much. I would love to continue the discussion forever, but we are hitting time. I want to thank our panelists so much for your words and your intelligence and your experiences on this topic. I want to thank the co-sponsors of this event, the American Muslim Bar Association, Justice for Muslims Collective, the Shia Racial Justice Coalition, Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, and the Afghan Diaspora for Equality and Progress. The last thing that I want to say is that I hope that folks walk away from this event understanding way more about the Hazara genocide, the incredible difficulties that the Hazara community faces in Afghanistan, not just now, but the centuries-long discrimination and persecution that has existed. Dr. Ghazabi has done a wonderful job explaining how it's very much politically motivated in some respects, how lands have been taken away, and one of the things that reminds me of is very much the intersectionality of it all. There are folks around the world that are fighting to get their land back, and that's no different from our Hazara brothers and sisters. So I hope that this event has been enlightening to all. Again, I will drop the resources link one more time into the chat. There is a form there if there's any panelists that you'd like more information from, or would like to reach out to them, have their contact info, please fill out that form, ask that question, we'll definitely reach out. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks so much again for hosting this conversation as well. I think your allyship is much needed and much appreciated during this time. And there is going to be an ongoing awareness campaign happening soon. I think, I'm not sure if anyone wants to elaborate on that, but do get in touch if you feel like you want to support an awareness campaign or amplify it through your networks. Get in touch. I'm not sure if Mashal is here, but if she is, maybe she can.
There's just very quickly, there's a Stop Hazara Genocide campaign that is on social media. There's an Instagram live on that will be on October 24th, in a movie screening on November 7th, and demonstrations globally that's being anticipated for in November. And so we'll add all of that information in the resources doc as well. So if you are interested in following along with the Stop Hazara Genocide campaign, more information will be in that document.
Thank you so much, Halima, Sumaira, and everyone at the team for this amazing panel and giving us the opportunity to speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, thanks everyone. I think Sumaira, you're the host, so